Hi guys, I'm Lawrence and this is Planet Moonshine, the channel where we use home distilling techniques and equipment in a professional microbrewery. And our goal is to ask the question, can we make any money out of doing this? In this video we're going to take a look at distillation columns, types of still, and why I made the choices that I made in selecting my column. We're going to take a quick look at the theory of distillation, and then we're going to go in depth into differences between different types of still and column. After that, we're going to take a quick look at how we power the still, and then we'll look at cleaning the still and setting it up for first use. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, stick around. If you like the content, please give us a thumbs up, it really helps the channel. In future videos we're going to talk about fermentations, washes, different types of product, and we'll talk to people about what they think of the product and whether or not they'd be interested in buying it. So without further ado, let's get into today's video. Okay, different types of stills and columns. We're going to focus in on home distillation equipment, the sort of thing that's suitable for use with a converted keg like the one that we've got. I'm going to start off by saying that I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. What I've learned over the last several months, I've learned by studying YouTube videos and reading forums and wikis. So yeah, if I make any mistakes, please do comment down below and let me know. And if you have any suggestions for things I need to cover, then again, let me know. If you want to know more about the process of how I made my keg, that was the subject of a previous video, so I'll put a link to that up here, or maybe up there, I'm not sure, but I think up here. So, for a converted keg, or keggle, as some people call them, the world of columns tends to divide into two main options: pot still or reflux still. And we're going to take a look at each of those and the reasons why you might choose one or the other. But to understand that, we need to understand a little more about the basic principles of distillation. So, in order to distill a liquid, you need a base liquid to start with, and if you're making spirits, that really needs to contain alcohol. So that could be a basic beer, a sugar wash, wine, any other spirit that you choose to put in there, a fruit wash, anything you fancy. All of these washes are basically a mixture of ethanol and water in varying quantities and with different flavour compounds associated with them. When this liquid's heated in the still, obviously at some point it starts to boil, and what happens is that the alcohol, more volatile components of the liquid tend to boil earlier than the water compounds and some of the flavour compounds. So although there's always a certain amount of both involved in the steam that comes off of the contents of the keg, it does tend to be the alcohol-rich content that comes off first and the water-rich content that comes off later. So these vapours rise up inside the still and we channel them down a particular route, and then we condense them by cooling. And as the vapour condenses back into a liquid, we get our distillate, which we collect in a collection jar. So a still has three main parts: a boiler, a column or something to direct the flow of vapour, and a condenser to condense that vapour back into distillate. So that's nice and easy, but even in a pot still, some of the vapour that rises up towards the point of no return is going to condense, and it's going to condense on the outside of that vapour path, and run back down into the pot. This is known as passive reflux. So any vapor that doesn't pass the point of no return goes back down into the pot as a liquid, and any vapor that does pass the point of no return is condensed and taken off our product collection point. So the other common type of still is a reflux still, and in this case we're talking about active reflux, where we are consciously forcing the vapor to recondense before it passes the point of no return. So there is another small condenser in the path, sometimes referred to as a deflegmator, and this actively forces liquid back down the column. Now, reflux stills break down into various categories, depending upon how the vapor is controlled and how the choice between refluxing and collecting product is controlled. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the main differences between a pot still and a reflux still. So, in a reflux still, a certain amount of the vapor is condensed before it passes the point of no return and falls back down into the boiler. What happens as it travels back down is really quite interesting. On the way back down, that liquid will interact with the steam that's rising up the column. During this interaction, some of the alcohol components of the falling liquid will interact with the steam that's rising and return back to vapor. What this does is it enriches the vapor that's travelling up the still and reduces the amount of alcohol in the liquid that's falling back down the still. It also has an interesting side effect, which is that flavour compounds tend to stay in the liquid and not travel back up the column as vapour. Well, some do, but the majority will stay in the column and go back down into the pot. So the result of this is a reflux still will produce a purer, higher alcohol product than a pot still. Conversely, a pot still will produce a slightly lower alcohol product, but with much more flavour. This means that pot stills lend themselves well towards producing whiskies and rums, very flavourful spirits, whereas reflux stills lend themselves towards creating more neutral spirits like vodka and gin. Aha! But what if you want to distill sometimes whiskey, sometimes gin, sometimes rum, sometimes vodka? Then you need a modular still. A still which you can operate in pot still mode to make whiskies and rums, and quite quickly convert it into a reflux still for making gins and vodkas. So, because I want to make both, I'm leaning towards a modular still. Now, let's consider what goes into the column. In its simplest form, it really is just an empty tube. But many people pack that tube with something to increase the amount of interaction between the falling liquid and the rising vapor. The more interaction you get, the purer the spirit you get, and the better the reflux still works. So, some distillers pack their columns with copper scrubbies. Literally, they buy pure copper scrubby and just stuff many of them inside their column to pack it tightly so the scrubbies remain in place and don't fall out the bottom. All of these coils of copper give a very complex path for the vapor to rise through and a very complex path for the liquid to fall through. Thus, the amount of interaction that takes place in between is massively increased. But people use all kinds of things. I've heard of people using glass marbles, specially made little ceramic tubes, something called SPP, which is basically tightly wound wire in prismatic coils. So there are many things you can do to pack your still, but it's generally a good idea to encourage that interaction between the vapor and the liquid. So another common solution to this problem is what's known as a bubble plate or a perf plate. Both of these devices try to do the same thing. At several levels within the column, they attempt to force the vapor that's rising up to go through a series of small holes and into a pool of liquid that has collected on the top of the plate. That then forces the vapors to bubble through the liquid, and when the amount of liquid on the plate gets too big, it spills over a lip and runs down to the next section or back down into the still, as is the case. So there is a saying amongst still designers, and that is height for purity, width for speed. The implication of this is that the taller you build your column, the more pure alcohol you will get, more neutral alcohol, and higher alcohol by volume that you will take off as product. The wider the diameter of your column, the faster this process will take place. So that sounds great. Who wouldn't want the tallest, widest column that they could get? Because it sounds like a fantastic plan. Well, obviously, the taller and the wider your column gets, the heavier it becomes, the more expensive it becomes, and well, we're kind of getting out of home distillation territory a little bit and moving into more professional equipment. And you know, on an industrial scale, columns could be 30 meters tall, that's 100 feet, and have 80, 90 sections in them with their own bubble plates or perf plates or whatever the solution is inside that column. Another downside of making your column bigger and wider is that you require more power from your boiler to push the vapor all the way to the top of that column. So we're definitely outside the realms of a keg conversion. So for my 50-litre keg with a 3 kilowatt power element in it, I opted for a 3-inch column, 3-inch diameter, about 1 meter tall, with 4 bubble plates inside of it. Sorry for the mix-up in units here, but for some reason, when you talk about column width, people talk in imperial units, inches, and because I live in Europe, I always think about other things like height in meters. So there you go. So we come to the next question. To buy our column or to build our column? Now, that comes down to a few factors as far as I'm concerned. One of them is the availability of materials to construct your column from. Many home distillers use copper tube, 2-inch, 3-inch or 4-inch, to construct their column out of. But I just can't get hold of that kind of copper easily here in Spain. So that's kind of difficult. Next issue is your building skills. How comfortable do you feel soldering stainless steel to copper? Well, it's actually not that difficult if you've got the right equipment. But if you are not at all confident about your ability to do that, then making your column looks a little bit more daunting. And finally, the time it takes to do the job. If you're trying to build a fairly complicated solution, then it's going to take you a long time to put that together. And if that's not easy for you, then probably your best option is to buy. So those are the things to bear in mind. Availability of parts to build with, your ability as a builder, the time it takes to build them, all of that versus the cost of buying an assembled column. So all of that for me pushes the old swingometer in the direction of buying a column, and really that probably means that my cheapest option is going to somewhere like China. So looking at pre-built columns, you have a further choice whether to get your column made from stainless steel or from copper. Now, copper is beautiful. We all love a bit of copper. And it's also more expensive. And I think the other important thing to mention about copper is you always want to have some copper in your vapor path, because one of the things that copper does is remove some nasty sulfides from the distillate as it passes over the copper. So you always want to have some copper in your vapor path, or have another way of dealing with that problem. So my purchase was from AliExpress, and what I opted for was a 3-inch column with 4 bubble plate sections and a deflegmator. Of course, the condenser also is part of the package. This one also came with a device called a parrot, which is used for measuring the gravity or the alcohol content of the distillate as it comes off the still. Also included was a water system to run through the 2 condensers, and everything needed to connect that to the mains. And there was also a 3-inch to 2-inch adapter so that the column could be fitted onto the 2-inch outlet of my converted keg. Also part of the package, all of the necessary tri-clamps and gaskets. And all of that for the princely sum of £330 sterling, 389 euros, or 458 US dollars. I chose stainless steel as the metal for the body of my column, and the bubble plates, of course, are made of copper. I also decided to buy a 3-inch sight glass. 2 reasons for this. One, because it's a modular solution. I would be able to put the sight glass at the bottom of the column so I could see very easily if the still was starting to puke before it got up into the bubble plates. Puking is basically boiling over. So if you charge the still with something that is prone to being foamy when it's boiled, you can have this effect called puking, where basically a load of foam gushes up your column and gushes up your bubble plates, or goes through your packing media and basically makes it a bit of a pain in the butt to clean. You have to take it all to pieces and clean it all down. So if I could see that early enough, I could switch it off before it got to the bubble plates, let the foam subside, and then start it up again. Another thing I can do with my 3-inch sight glass is move it to the top of the column above the deflegmator, and there it can be used with a small container as a gin basket. Basically, I can put botanicals into the gin basket, and the vapor that passes the deflegmator will infuse from those botanicals, and when it comes past the point of no return, well, hey, we've got ourselves a nicely flavoured gin. So how does it convert into being a pot still? Well, either you can leave everything in place and just not operate the deflegmator, don't run anything through it, no coolant liquid to run through it, and that way the vapour can just mostly pass up across the point of no return and down to be condensed. Or you could remove it. You could simply take that out. If you wanted to have even less passive reflux taking place, you can remove the bubble plates but leave the column sections in place without the bubble plates. And again, you're going back to a more simple pot still style. So there we have it. A 3-inch column running off my 50-litre converted keg with a 3 kilowatt power element. Before we get into cleaning and setup, there is one more vital piece of equipment we need to discuss, and that is how to control the power to the heat source, our elements. When you're running the still at full power, you don't need any such control. You could just plug the element straight into the mains and let it go. But when you want more control over your output, you absolutely need to turn the heat down to balance the still, or when you're performing a spirit run, to run your spirit off with greater control. And whilst controlling flavour and ABV is really the subject for a future video, I think we should talk a little bit about how power is controlled. So there are two main ways that people control power to the elements. Some people advocate a control loop which runs a thermocouple taking temperature down in the boiler or at the top of the still, and using that information to very rapidly switch the elements on and off to control the amount of power. Obviously, the longer the off time, the less heat is generated. The longer the on time, the more heat is generated. These types of control loop are known as PID loops, and you use a PID controller to manage them. And their setup is kind of complicated, and their building is much more complicated than the other really common type of control mechanism. And that type of control mechanism is effectively altering the amount of voltage that goes to your elements, turning that up or down, turns the power up or down, and that in turn turns the heat up or down. So controlling the input voltage to the elements is usually done using something called a rheostat or using an SCR controller. Both are essentially a dial that you twist that effectively reduces the voltage. The vast majority of these control circuits are completely manual. You set the dial to where you want it to get the power that you want to drive the still the way you want to drive it. There is no feedback loop. You may have a thermometer in your system which tells you the temperature. You could look at that. You may choose to put a voltmeter or an amp meter in your system, which tells you how far you've turned the dial and therefore what the resultant voltage is that's going through to the elements. So with this kind of setup, the operator uses his eyes and ears to figure out what's going on with the power to the elements. Now, this type of equipment is much less complicated to build than the PID control loop. However, you do still need some basic electronic skills, and you need to be comfortable messing around with mains electrical voltage, because that's effectively what you're doing. So if you haven't got those kind of skills, you need to get someone to make one for you or buy one off the shelf. I was able to make mine, and I knew that in my control system there were a few things that I wanted. One, I wanted the enclosure box to be waterproof. Why? Because this is a brewery and we spray water all over the place when we're cleaning, and I wouldn't want any water getting inside and causing a short circuit. So a waterproof enclosure. Next, I want to be able to plug my control unit directly into a mains output socket so that I'm not hardwiring the controller into the main circuit that runs around the brewery. Finally, I wanted to be able to plug the element into a standard power socket on the control unit so that I could unplug the element from the control unit and take it out of the keg for cleaning because it's on a tri-clamp fitting. So those were my requirements when building my SCR. I also definitely wanted to have an on-off switch and to have a voltage and amp meter so that I could see proportionately how far I'd turned the voltage up and down. Now, I built mine using some instructional videos on YouTube and whatever basic electronics knowledge I already had to start with. If you want to do this yourself, just search SCR controllers on YouTube. There's plenty of videos out there, but I will say one more time, don't mess around with electrics unless you're confident and safe. So that's about it for power control. Let's move on to cleaning the still and preparing it for first use. So step one is to clean out your still with hot soapy water, give it a good scrub around inside. Why do this? Because like me, you probably used a lot of mineral oil to cool down the cutting tools that we're using to cut holes in the keg. There's probably plenty of that inside. You've probably also cleaned it up with some form of abrasive, be that a file, be that wire wool, I shouldn't use wire wool, or be that any other kind of abrasive paper, emery paper, sandpaper, flapper disc, wire wool brush, any of those things. If you use them, you left residues on the inside of your keg and you don't want that getting into your product. So hot soapy water wash, rinse out the little solidy bits that go with that and give the whole thing a dry out inside. Second, most home distillers perform a vinegar run. A vinegar run is quite simply going out and buying some vinegar, pouring enough of it into your still to cover the elements and then a little bit more to leave some headroom so that when the liquid boils down, the elements aren't exposed and ruined. So you run the still pretty much on full power with that vinegar inside it for about 15 to 20 minutes after it started boiling. Once it starts to boil, you'll know because there'll be hot steam coming out of the product spout. Good idea not to inhale that, it's not very nice. Won't kill you, but just keep your nose away. Now, for this vinegar run, pretty much any type of acid would actually do the trick. It doesn't have to be vinegar. Because I work in a professional brewery, I have access to peracetic acid, which I use in the cleaning processes for many of my stainless steel pieces of equipment around the brewery. So for me, that was easier than going out and buying vinegar. So whilst you can use any acid, I would really avoid using some of the more dangerous acids like sulfuric and nitric, because those can give off very poisonous fumes and you really do not want to be inhaling that. Unless you've got yourself a plague suit to put on, you know, then you can do what you like. Okay, so the still is fully charged with a mixture of peracetic acid and water. We're boiling, it took about half an hour to come up. We've got a lot of steam coming out the parrot. And the temperature gauge is round to 100. So I think we're doing absolutely great on our cleaning run. Just going to open this bottom needle valve, drain some water out of there that's recondensing inside. But yeah, it's going good. The third and final step is what's called a sacrificial alcohol run. That is exactly what it sounds like. You charge your still with some alcoholic wash. Again, not too much, just enough to cover the elements and allow you 15 or 20 minutes of boiling so those elements don't get exposed. And again, you're running your still at full power, and what you're doing is you're using that alcohol vapor to blast its way through the vapor path of your still. Having done all of that, you simply drain the contents and hose it out, and you're ready for your first product run. So here we are doing a sacrificial alcohol run. It's been going for a while now. The head temperature is pretty high. We've got a steady stream coming off the still. We're running at full power just to clean it through. I've let a fair bit of alcohol vapor go, and at the moment we're collecting at about 50%, with completely passive reflux taking place inside the column. That is, that this condensing segment, the defragmator, is not turned on, only the shotgun condenser to take off the alcohol. So that's it for this video. And again, we must ask our final question. Have I built a still that I can use to make spirits that people will buy? Well, I believe the answer is yes, but time will tell, and we'll find out in future videos. So, thank you for watching this video from Planet Moonshine, and for watching it all the way to the end. If you like the content, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to give me comments or suggestions or just tell me about some mistakes I've made, please, it's lovely to hear from you. I'd love you to do that, but be positive. And finally, I guess it's time to talk about the next video that we're going to make. So the next video is going to be about taking some beer, finished product from my brewery that is now too old to sell. Basically, when COVID came along, our sales volume declined quite dramatically as most of our customers were closed, leaving us with a lot of beer sat around. And when that beer passed its sell-by date, I could no longer sell it to customers. What to do with it? Aha! Let's distill it and see if we can recover that alcohol and turn it into something that people will want to buy. So, if that sounds interesting to you, I suggest you subscribe, yeah, and ring that bell so you get notified when the next video is out. So, it's been great fun for me, and I'm Lawrence. This is Planet Moonshine, and that's it for this video. Peace out.